Hello, you are listening to an episode of Trade Talks, a podcast about the economics of trade policy. I'm Samaya Keynes, the Trade and Globalization Editor for The Economist.
And I'm Chad Bown, a senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics.
This episode is one that we have been promising for a while. We're going to be talking to Paul Blustein, a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, about his new book, Schism: China, America, and the Fracturing of the Global Trading System.
Paul's book covers a lot of stuff, but we thought we would dive deeply into one of the things that Paul writes about, which is how hard it was for China to get into the World Trade Organization, or the WTO.
Right now, there are a lot of people in Washington, D.C. who think that there was something wrong about that decision. And maybe if we knew then what we know now, perhaps something would have been done differently. I think if you take away anything from this discussion, it's that these talks were really difficult. The Chinese definitely didn't come away thinking, haha, we've screwed over the Americans. If anything, it was the opposite.
Before we start, there are a few things that listeners should know. China was actually one of the founding members of the WTO's predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, all the way back in 1947. But shortly after the GATT got started, there was a change in the Chinese government. The communists took over, and their new leadership just wasn't interested in participating in the multilateral system.
The other thing to frame this discussion is that China's eventual entry into the WTO was a multi-step process. Before China could be accepted by the general membership, it basically had to get sign-off from the US. So first, there was a massive bilateral negotiation that happened between the US and China. And it's those bilateral discussions that our conversation with Paul is going to be focusing on. Now, obviously, getting into the World Trade Organization properly means that everyone has to sign on. It's a consensus-based organization. But the way things worked in this case, it was the US that was really the toughest hurdle. Now, we all know the end of this story. China got into the WTO in December of 2001. But the story started 15 years earlier. It took China 15 years to get in. I started off by asking Paul what the various setbacks were.
Well, when China first wanted to get back in 1986, when it started to become an export powerhouse. And at that time, it was an incredibly poor, backward country, and there didn't seem to be that much of a problem with the idea of having, there were plenty of other poor and backward countries that were in the GATT. And the negotiations were going, fairly swimmingly until June of 1989, when I'm sure many of your listeners remember the Tiananmen Square incident, to put it very euphemistically, and then the idea of bringing China into the GATT was off the table for a long, long time.
To any listeners who don't know, in 1989, Chinese soldiers fired on and killed hundreds of peaceful students and pro-democracy protesters in Beijing.
But China continued to do business internationally and continued to pursue its efforts to try to integrate itself with the trading system throughout the 90s, very successfully, I might add. It was attracting a lot of multinational companies from the United States, even though the U.S. Congress was every year having a vote about whether China would be allowed basically to sell its goods in the United States. They would review the human rights policy of China and say, well, have you done good enough in the past year? And every year, big multinational companies in China would manage to persuade Congress that it would be a very bad idea to just basically cut things off. But year after year, this was really causing a lot of uncertainty for the Chinese economy, whether they were going to be able to continue to do business in their biggest market. So China was really badly wanted in. And but the negotiations continued. China still wasn't allowed to get in even after 1995, when the WTO was created. The idea of letting them in was still, because of Tiananmen Square, was just not on. I remember one of the stories I heard was really interesting. In 1998, there was a big summit in Beijing, where President Clinton went to meet President Jiang Zemin. I was actually coincidentally there and was covering the very friendly state dinner. But the negotiations were still stalled partly because of the political reaction in the United States toward China, partly because China simply wasn't ready to take the steps, as far as the U.S. was concerned, to liberalize its economy enough. And Charlene Barshevsky, who was the U.S. trade representative at the time, told me that she passed Bill Clinton in the hall of their hotel, and he said, "Are we getting close?" And she said, "Nope, we're nowhere." And he said, "Okay." So the U.S. was continuing to just say, "No, China, you're not ready. You cannot get into this organization." But finally, in 1999, things really started heating up.
So what happened? What made 1999 kind of this key turning point for eventually getting China into the WTO?
Well, I would say that the key turning point was that Zhu Rongji became premier of China. And he was a guy who had been picked by Deng Xiaoping, the supreme leader of China who took over after Mao Zedong. Zhu Rongji was recognized by Deng as not only a guy who really understood economics much better than most other people in the Chinese government at the time, but who had real leadership capacities. And he became premier. He had been vice premier in charge of the economy starting in 1991, and really did an amazing job with privatizing a lot of the state-owned enterprises. And I say privatizing, he wasn't completely privatizing them, but they were selling off good parts of them to the stock market and trying to turn them into profit-making entities. And that was a very successful thing. So he was rewarded by being promoted from vice premier to premier. And he was really the visionary who brought China in. And once he began really pushing for it in late 1998, then things started to really, I think, to move.
Now, obviously, China had some tricky internal politics.
Well, I mean, Zhu Rongji, couldn't single-handedly push, the Chinese party state in a liberalizing direction, but he really did push hard. He overcame resistance from hardliners like his predecessor was Li Peng, who was vilified for his role in the Tiananmen Square massacre, and Li Peng had the attitude that we have to keep our state enterprises. These are the crown jewels of our Maoist system. Zhu Rongji thought that these things were dinosaurs, that they were holding the Chinese economy back. I think he was absolutely right. They were a huge drag. They required massive subsidies. They were extremely inefficient. They absorbed enormous amounts of bank loans that could have been lent to much more productive enterprises. And so he was really pushing hard to move the rest of the leadership in a direction so that China could open up and meet the requirements that the U.S. was insisting on.
I think the point to take away here is just how recent the political embrace of China was. This was in the late 1990s when the U.S. was saying no on human rights, on the incompatibility of China's economic system. We're just not going to let you trade with us on the terms that you want.
So the year is 1999. Negotiations are really stuck. They hadn't been going anywhere. But then there's something of a turning point. Alan Greenspan, then the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who we really wouldn't normally associate with trade policy, he helped to move things along. He was in China to just talk about unrelated things, the Chinese financial system, the Asian financial crisis, that sort of thing. And he had this meeting with Zhu Rongji. The State Department essentially coached him to try and get the Chinese to be more forthcoming in these trade talks. And meanwhile, the people in the U.S. Embassy in China were contacting everyone that they could think of, everyone in the Chinese government, for example, to tell them to please, to try to be more forthcoming, to try and make more of an effort with these talks, or else the U.S. might give up.
After they talked mostly about monetary and banking issues, Zhu Rongji said, excuse me, there's one subject I need to bring up with you. I apologize. I know this isn't your area, but I'm going to meet with President Clinton in April in Washington. I've been invited for a summit. And I hope that at that time we might reach an agreement for China to enter the WTO. And he mentioned several conditions that China would be prepared to make in terms of how fast it would be willing to liberalize. Transition periods wouldn't be that long, that kind of thing. And Greenspan, who had been primed to expect this, said, "Well, actually, that's of great interest to me." So he then brought word back to Washington, and I actually got to see. Someone showed me notes of a meeting that among sort of the high-ranking trade officials when they were meeting, and they were just trying to decide, are we going to really try to pursue this whole effort this year to get China into the WTO. And look, Greenspan met with Zhu Rongji, and it really sounds like they're ready to do business. So that really was a kind of a pivotal moment in the whole saga.
So after these positive signals, the talks really get going.
Charlene Barshevsky and a guy named Bob Cassidy, who was the assistant U.S. trade representative for China, and some of the deputies in the U.S. trade representative's office were flying back and forth constantly. And Chinese were also flying. They were flying from Beijing to Washington. And, because they were negotiating over, an immensely complicated agreement that involved incomprehensibly voluminous and detailed issues about how the Chinese economy was going, what they were going to have to do in order to gain admission to the WTO. And of course, China wanted to do as little as possible, and do it as slowly as possible. And the Americans were putting their foot down and saying, no, it has to be done. It has to be done quickly, and it has to be done a lot. But because of Zhu Rongji, who really, in his heart of hearts, he believed that a lot of what the Americans were demanding would be good for China. The Chinese government became much, much more forthcoming during the spring months of 1999 after the meeting between Greenspan and Zhu Rongji. So a lot of progress was being made, and this was going to be it was looking like it was shaping up as a very historic summit between Zhu Rongji and Bill Clinton.
As those talks are going on, the two sides were negotiating over a massive range of issues, including standard market access and some that went deeply into the way the Chinese system of governance worked.
Across the board, the U.S. was demanding liberalization, meaning lowering tariffs. Chinese tariffs on autos, for example, were at 100%. Auto parts, all sorts of manufactured products, all sorts of agricultural products. There were a lot of quotas to limit the amount of imports that could come into the country. China was becoming this incredible market. Over a period of years, it would set up more phone lines, 4 times the number of phone lines or something than even existed in Britain. And so all these American companies were desperate to get into that market. The Chinese were saying, if you want a piece of this lucrative action, you have to set up chip manufacturing facilities in China. The U.S. was saying, you can't do that anymore. We're not going to allow you to require foreign companies to transfer technology just as a condition of access to the Chinese market. Now, this, of course, remains a bone of contention today, whether China has really gone along with that. One of the most important things was transparency, because the way the Chinese system worked, it was kind of mind-boggling. If you were a foreign business person in China, or even a Chinese business person, and you ran afoul of some regulation, some official could pull out a regulation or a law and say, you're in big trouble now, pal. And the business person would say, wait, I didn't know that that law existed. Oh yes, we have that law. You just, we don't have to publish them all. We just have them. So one of the most important things the U.S. side wanted was an insistence that, look, if you're going to have these regulations or laws, whatever they are, you can't enforce them unless they're published. And, this sounds like, duh, okay, why not? Why shouldn't you publish laws? Any modern system has that. But China didn't at that time. That's the way their legal system worked. So that was a crucial demand for the U.S. side.
There were some areas where the Chinese were just not going to give the United States what they wanted. There were some things that were just off limits.
Still a bone of contention today is telecommunications. The Chinese were simply not willing to open their market to allow foreigners to operate telecommunications service companies because, China it's a dictatorship. I mean, they simply don't allow people to say anything that they want. And they thought that if they allowed foreign telecommunications companies in, that it would be a lot more difficult for them to restrict that. But for most other products, the U.S. was demanding a lot of liberalization, and Zhu Rongji was pushing as hard as he could to get his colleagues to go along.
It's important to remember that as all this was going on, there was a lot of concern on the Chinese side about what all this would actually mean.
I mean, part of it was ideological, the idea that, after all, we're loyal communists and we shouldn't give up our prized state-owned enterprises. But a lot of it was fear of what would happen to ordinary Chinese workers and farmers. Looking back on it, it's really striking to see how fearful large elements in the Chinese establishment, not just the government, but in academia, in think tanks in China, a lot of them were very concerned. The term that was sort of popular about all this is the wolf is coming. On the American side, there were also people worried about the wolf is coming if we let China in. But on the Chinese side, there was, and it's quite understandable that they would be as concerned as they were, because American business in the late 1990s was really, I mean, it was the envy of the world. This was the period of the dot-com bubble, and all these hotshot companies were flourishing. So the Asian financial crisis had occurred, so Asia was not looking like such a miracle anymore. Europe was still struggling to keep up with U.S. companies.
Now, obviously, there were worries on the US side too, from organized labor, from some who worried that even after any reforms, China's legal system was just not going to sit well alongside the norms of the multilateral rules-based system.
It's not the case that everyone in the U.S. thought that this would go well, but it does seem like the fears in China that this would be an economic disaster were much more widespread than in the U.S.
Back to the negotiations. Remember, after this meeting with Zhu Rongji and Alan Greenspan, the negotiators are working overtime. They're flying back and forth between Beijing and DC. They're trying to get this deal for the summit in the spring of 1999.
So this summit that was going to occur in basically April 7th to April 12th or so in Washington was going to be an action-forcing event, as summits often are, which everyone thought was likely to end in an agreement between Zhu Rongji and Clinton that would pave the way for China to enter the WTO. And the negotiations were really heating up, even just before, in the days just before Zhu arrived in Washington. His chief negotiator, Long Yong-tu, arrived 2 days before and immediately went into negotiations with Charlene Barshevsky and her team, and they reached agreement on some of the still outstanding crucial issues. And Clinton was giving all these signs indicating that he was ready. He gave us a speech on April 7th, just as Zhu was flying from Los Angeles. He said, the bottom line is, if China is willing to play by the global rules of trade, it would be an inexplicable mistake for the United States to say no. So all the signs were pointing toward an agreement. However, behind the scenes, there was a huge debate going on within the White House and top levels of the cabinet. The U.S. government was really divided, and there was a lot of stuff out in the press about this between people who thought that it would be a real mistake to say no at this summit, and people who thought, no, we do have to say no at this summit. Not absolutely no, China will never get into the WTO, but if we strike a deal now, we'll be accused by all of China's critics, we'll be accused by the labor movement, by the Republicans, who were then just absolutely bashing Bill Clinton for this, that, and the other thing. And Clinton was in a politically weakened position at that point because, remember, the Monica Lewinsky scandal. He had just survived impeachment, and he did not want to have to say to Democratic members of Congress, you got to take this really tough vote to let China into the WTO. So there was the politicos in the White House were saying, Mr. President, we can't cut this deal now, you'll get clobbered. We won't be able to get it through Congress, even if you do cut the deal. So there was a huge debate going on, but a lot of the foreign policy establishment was very concerned that by saying no to Zhu Rongji and really causing him to lose face, that he would become incredibly weakened within the Chinese establishment. So a big debate was going on.
And then what happened? What did Clinton decide?
After giving this speech, at which he said it would be an inexplicable mistake to say no, Clinton said no. He did it as only Bill Clinton can do, with his arm around Drew's shoulder and, really glad handing him and all. He did it in a way that was designed to, not really anger him, but he took him to the yellow room in the White House, which is on the residence side, with a glorious view overlooking Washington at night. And he said, look, my foreign policy people tell me that if we don't strike a deal, that you'll really be damaged, and your whole move toward reform in China will be hurt. Now, if that's true, then I'm ready to call Charlene Barshevsky and have her get with your people, and maybe you can work out the last details. But I hope you understand that my political people are concerned that if we do a deal now, we won't be able to get it through Congress, and that would be bad for both of us. So he was laying it on thick, but Zhu Rongji understood exactly what was going on. Clinton was saying, politically, I'm not ready to do this. I'm really worried about being criticized. So at that point, the summit became a colossal failure.
So against everyone's expectations, in the spring of 1999, the deal did not get done. The Chinese side was furious.
It then got even worse because even at the U.S. Trade Representative's office, people thought that a deal was going to be done. So they had drawn up a 17-page piece of paper, and in 17 pages, you could only summarize all the things that China was agreeing to do as part of this huge deal. And they put it out on the internet for everyone to see. And at that time in China, you could see pretty much any website you wanted as long as it didn't talk about Tiananmen Square and Tibet and in Taiwan, certain other sort of forbidden issues. So even in China, they could see these incredible concessions that the Chinese side was making. This absolutely infuriated the Chinese even more than they, as disappointed as they were that they weren't getting the deal struck that they wanted. They were also being embarrassed by showing that they had actually been extremely forthcoming in trying to negotiate with the U.S. The sort of hilarious thing was that the U.S. side put out this story that this had been a mistake, that somebody had sort of pressed the send button and published this document that had been prepared. And it was logical that the document would be prepared because people at the U.S. Trade Representative's office thought a deal was going to be done. You have to tell the public, what are the terms that have been struck. So they had to have this document ready. So they made it sound as if they had accidentally published this very sensitive document full of showing what all the Chinese concessions were. In fact, I've talked to the people involved, and they say no. This was a deliberate and in retrospect quite brilliant Machiavellian ploy, with Charlene Barshevsky being pretty much the ringleader. She figured that if these concessions were all published in black and white, that U.S. companies would see what they were supposed to be getting, and it would be more difficult for, once a deal was struck, for China to backtrack on those things, because then there would be screaming and yelling in the U.S. saying, well, why are we giving in on things that China has already conceded on?
This may have been a Machiavellian move, but there were costs. The Chinese negotiator standing in China was damaged. The Chinese were really upset. This is not what they wanted out of this big summit. They were embarrassed, and they were incredibly angry at their American counterparts. Now,
the Chinese may have been angry, but part of Charlene's plan really did seem to work. The business community were absolutely fuming at all of these potential concessions that they could have got out of the Chinese that now they weren't going to get. There was a lot of blowback against Bill Clinton as well, a lot of criticism for letting the big one get away.
Even though the Chinese were angry, the talks didn't stop. One of the U.S. negotiators goes over to China. He gets yelled at. The Chinese say the U.S. is going to have to concede on a few things. But yes, okay, they can all proceed based broadly on where they had gotten to just before the summit.
So May 7th, a few weeks after the summit, Charlene Barshevsky, the US chief negotiator, goes to the White House with this plan, says to Bill Clinton, this is what we're going to do. Bill Clinton says, okay, just make sure we don't concede on anything too big, but okay.
So that very day, a B-1B bomber took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and flew to Belgrade on a mission in the war over Kosovo and unleashed 5 precision-guided missiles that struck the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. It was because of some mistake by the CIA. The missiles, they hit the building that they were supposed to hit, but it turned out because of some outdated map that it was now the Chinese embassy that was located in that building. So 3 people were killed. I mean, this all happened on a Friday evening in Washington. That news broke that on CNN, this is how the White House found out about it, because, that's the way news traveled by that point. So the White House went into overdrive to try to draft an apology for this mistake, this tragic mistake of having, bombed the Chinese embassy. And a letter from Clinton was delivered to the Chinese embassy on Sunday morning. The Chinese simply didn't believe it. And to this day, you can talk to people in China who say, no, we're convinced this was a deliberate act by the United States. The reasons for it are, from an American standpoint, from a Western standpoint, inexplicable. Why would the U.S. do such a thing? But, the Chinese have this mentality that as they develop, other countries are going to try to keep them down, particularly the U.S. And there were all sorts of, I think I would call them conspiracy theories in China. Anyway, there were riots there. And, the discussions that went on in the Chinese leadership, it's very clear that most of them did not believe that this was an accident.
This is a lot of drama for one trade negotiation. But we all do know how it ends. They do eventually push past these setbacks to get a deal. The bombing happened in May. And by November, they've managed to pick things up again, and they're really, really close.
There was still some more drama, obviously. The Americans walked out at one point. They even phoned President Clinton and said, we're sorry, it would be unseemly to agree to this deal.
But the next day, after 5 days of talks on what was supposed to be a 2-day trip by Charlene and her team in Beijing, they go to the Trade Ministry in China for one last try.
At a meeting that took place on Sunday morning that had been scheduled, the American side went to the Trade Ministry. This was at the Chinese Trade Ministry. And people had been up all night. Each side was furious at the other at how things were going. But then Wu Yi, a sort of matronly-looking woman, but a very tough Chinese negotiator, a very high-ranking woman in the Chinese leadership, appeared at the doorway and brought the news that the premier, Zhu Rongji, was coming to the Trade Ministry, and this in Chinese terms is really huge, because for a premier to sort of lower himself in protocol terms by coming to a mere ministry to meet with people from the other side, I mean, that sends a huge message. We are ready to deal. And that's exactly what happened. They went to the 11th floor of the Trade Ministry and had a meeting, Charlene Barshevsky leading the U.S. side and Zhu Rongji leading the Chinese side. And the Chinese didn't give on everything, but they gave on a lot. Enough that as far as the Americans were concerned, they thought they had a deal that they could take back to Washington and sell credibly as everything that they could possibly get. So, I mean, things almost fell apart. But the fact that, again, that Zhu Rongji went to the ministry in that way was, I think, a clear indication that the Chinese badly wanted in and were willing to deal.
Let's fast forward now. China enters the World Trade Organization. And the question is, was that a mistake? Could the Americans have secured better terms?
So looking back on this whole process of how the negotiations unfolded in November of 1999, when the final deal was struck in these long negotiations that went on for, basically around the clock for 6 days. it's reasonable to ask, to look back on it, because so much controversy has arisen about what, China's entry into the WTO, was that a good thing or not? It's reasonable to wonder, was the U.S. somehow gulled into letting the Chinese slide in? One of the most interesting pieces of evidence that I found in my research, it's a book by the author is a pseudonym, Zhong Hairen. And the reason it's a pseudonym is that it's about developments at very high levels inside the Chinese government that are not, of course, shrouded in secrecy under normal circumstances. And it's clear that the author is very close to Zhu Rongji. The book is called Zhu Rongji in 1999. It was published in 2002 in Chinese. So according to this book, which again is regarded as an authoritative account of meetings that were taking place in very high levels of the Chinese government, Zhu Rongji said to his colleagues, "We must cast away illusions that the U.S. will make concessions and take a step backward if we adopt a tough stance." And I read that sentence, I thought, well, this is really compelling evidence that from the Chinese standpoint, their backs were to the wall. They felt that they were being, their U.S. counterparts were extremely tough and not going to give in if China tried to play tough with them. Now, at that same meeting, Li Peng, who was the hard leader of the hardliners within the Chinese leadership, was saying we don't have to give in to the Americans. We can wait another 13 years, because it had then been 13 years since China had tried to enter the GATT. We can wait another 13 years if we have to. The U.S. bullies other countries, and we don't need to submit to this sort of bullying. But Zhu Rongji eventually won the day, and the Chinese side, recognizing that they were up against an extremely tough set of negotiators and taking a very hard stance on what China was going to have to do, a deal was finally signed.
So perhaps in China's entry to the World Trade Organization, which was primarily a negotiation between China and America, that deal then set the foundations for this wider deal that the rest of the membership would then accept. Perhaps nothing more could have been done to make it tougher on the Chinese. Do you think there were any mistakes made after that?
Yeah, both. I mean, the administrations that came after did make mistakes, I think. The Bush administration understandably thought, as the Clinton administration thought that by joining the WTO, China was really signaling it was going to be moving toward a market economy, and there would be ups and downs. And I've talked to a lot of people who were in the Bush administration handling trade issues, and that's what they've told me. They said, we realized, boy, were we wrong about that, because China did turn much more towards state capitalism and sort of the China Inc. system. We realize now that we were too optimistic.
As Paul's book makes clear, China's entry into the WTO did achieve a lot. China made a bunch of reforms. Its economy is now unrecognizable compared to where it was back before it joined the WTO. Some of that is because of the reforms that were pushed through because of this whole process. But obviously there were problems. China's management of its currency created a huge backlash within the United States. And American workers didn't adjust to the new import competition in the way that economists would have predicted. Though on that point, I would argue that it was probably more of a failure of America's domestic policy and not the fault of the trade negotiators.
Listeners really should read Paul's book to learn about what happened next. And of course, listen to Trade Talks. He talks about the fiasco of tackling currency manipulation at the IMF. He talks about the more recent step backwards and the retrenchment of state-owned enterprises under President Xi Jinping.
Paul also talks about all the problems that arose when China's legal system interacted with the multilateral rules-based system. For all of its reforms, the opacity of the Chinese system made it extremely difficult to hold it to account. Looking at Chinese law, there's no written down rule that requires companies transfer their technology, but in a lot of cases it still happened. And under WTO rules, there are limits on what subsidies that the government is allowed to give. But in China, it can be very unclear where the government stops and where the private sector begins. And that makes it hard to enforce the rules that, in theory, China has signed up to.
Yeah, the way I look at it is that the way China has evolved has created an existential challenge to the global trading system, to the WTO, not because of the terms by which China entered were bad, but because China managed to evolve in a way that the rule book can't cover.
Obviously, we will never know what might have been. Maybe the negotiators could have waited for longer before letting China into the system. Maybe they could have never let China in at all. Maybe we would be in a different position right now.
Maybe, even though China's system did evolve in a way that made it harder to enforce the rules, countries could have tried harder to do it.
We'll never know. But I would love to hear any listeners with very strong views either way. Paul, thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
That is all for Trade Talks. A huge thank you to Paul Blustein, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Do read his new book, Schism, China, America, and the Fracturing of the Global Trading System. And do read my review of his book on www.economist.com. We'll tweet it out.
Thanks also to Colin Warren, who handles our audio.
Now, Colin isn't responsible for all the weird music inserts. That was me. If you find it annoying, let us know, but please say something nice too, otherwise I'll feel really sad. If you find it atmospheric and awesome, then I really want to know.
Give us a shout out and rate us on iTunes. Or you can tweet at us.
I'm on @Samaya Keynes.
And I'm @Chad Bown.
And we're on @trade__talks.
That's not one but two underscores, @trade__talks.
Because when it comes to knowing about versions of history, two would be better to know about than one.